Hello, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Find yourself somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe and warm, and let yourself settle in as we journey together into the fascinating world of Victorian spiritualism and ghost clubs. This is a story of mystery and wonder, of drawing rooms filled with candlelight, and of people reaching across the veil between worlds. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to drift into this extraordinary chapter of history. Our story begins in the spring of 1848, in a small wooden house in Hydesville, New York. Two young sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, claimed to hear mysterious rapping sounds in their bedroom. Night after night, these knocks would echo through the walls, and the sisters discovered they could communicate with the presence making these sounds through a series of questions and responses. They would ask questions, and the spirit would reply with knocks. One knock for no, two for yes. Word of the Fox sisters spread like wildfire through New York and beyond, and within months, thousands of people were flocking to witness their demonstrations. These two young girls, just 14 and 11 years old, had unknowingly sparked a movement that would sweep across America and eventually cross the Atlantic Ocean to captivate Victorian Britain. By the early 1850s, spiritualism had reached the shores of England, arriving at precisely the right moment in history. You see, Victorian society was grappling with profound grief. The Industrial Revolution had brought people into crowded cities where diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis claimed lives suddenly and often. Families were losing children, spouses, and parents with heartbreaking frequency. The average life expectancy was only around 40 years, and it was rare to find a household untouched by death. Queen Victoria herself would soon become the most famous mourner in the world when Prince Albert died in 1861, and she would spend the remaining 40 years of her life in deep mourning, always dressed in black, forever longing to connect with her beloved husband once more. Into this landscape of loss came the promise of spiritualism, offering something that traditional religion couldn't quite provide in the same immediate way. The spiritualists proclaimed that death was not the end, that the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable, and most thrillingly, that ordinary people could communicate directly with those they had lost. You didn't need a priest or a church as an intermediary. You could sit in your own parlor, hold hands around a table, and potentially hear the voice of your departed mother, or receive a message from a child taken too soon. For grieving Victorians, this was an irresistible proposition. The heart of spiritualist practice was the séance, and these gatherings followed particular rituals that became remarkably standardized across Britain and America. Typically held in the evening, participants would gather in a darkened room, sitting around a table with their hands joined or resting flat on the surface. A medium, usually a woman, would serve as the conduit between worlds, entering a trance-like state to allow spirits to communicate through her. The darkness was considered essential, as spiritualists believed that light interfered with the delicate psychic energies needed for spirits to manifest. In this intimate, hushed atmosphere, with perhaps just a single candle flickering in the corner, participants would wait with held breath for signs from beyond. As spiritualism grew more popular throughout the 1850s, something remarkable happened. The movement began to organize itself, and educated, respectable members of Victorian society started taking it seriously as a subject worthy of investigation. In 1852, a group of concerned and curious individuals in London formed what would become one of the first organized ghost clubs. These weren't gatherings of superstitious villagers telling tales by firelight. These were lawyers, doctors, academics, and members of the clergy, coming together to investigate supernatural claims with scientific rigor. They wanted to know, could spiritualism be real? Were there genuine phenomena occurring, or was it all trickery and delusion? This question became even more pressing because spiritualism was developing increasingly dramatic manifestations. It was no longer just gentle table rapping. By the mid-1850s, mediums were reporting full-body apparitions appearing in séance rooms, objects flying through the air untouched by human hands, musical instruments playing themselves, and most spectacular of all, something called materialization, where spirits would supposedly build temporary physical bodies out of a mysterious substance called ectoplasm that flowed from the medium's body. Witnesses described ectoplasm as a strange, gauzy, luminous material that would emerge from the medium's mouth, nose, or even ears, gradually forming into recognizable human shapes before dissolving back into nothingness. These extraordinary claims demanded investigation. The Victorian ghost clubs approached their work with the methodical mindset of their age. Members would attend séances taking careful notes, checking rooms beforehand for hidden apparatus, sometimes even holding the medium's hands and feet throughout the session to prevent trickery. They published their findings in journals and pamphlets, debated vigorously among themselves, and slowly, a split emerged. Some investigators became convinced that certain phenomena were genuine and inexplicable by known science. Others grew increasingly skeptical, documenting the clever tricks and sleight of hand that fraudulent mediums employed. But whether believers or skeptics, these ghost clubs served a crucial function in Victorian society. They provided a framework for taking spiritualism seriously as a subject of inquiry, lending it a respectability that helped the movement flourish in drawing rooms across Britain. By 1855, spiritualism had become a genuine cultural phenomenon in Victorian England, with séances held in homes from the grandest country estates to modest urban terraces. The movement had gone from curious novelty to social institution in less than a decade, and our ghost clubs were right at the center of it all, investigating, documenting, and debating what it all meant. And this was only the beginning of the story, for the most extraordinary developments were still to come. As we move deeper into the 1850s and 60s, let's turn our attention to the mediums themselves, these remarkable individuals who claim to bridge the gap between life and death. What's particularly fascinating is that the vast majority of professional mediums were women, which was quite extraordinary in Victorian society where women had very few opportunities for public recognition or independent income. In an age when respectable women were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, spiritualism offered something revolutionary. A working-class woman with the right gifts could find herself sitting in aristocratic drawing rooms, being consulted by members of parliament, earning substantial fees, and wielding genuine influence. The séance room was one of the few places in Victorian Britain where a woman's voice, or rather, the voices speaking through her, could command absolute attention and authority. One of the most celebrated mediums of the Victorian era was Daniel Dunglass Home, and yes, despite what I just said about most mediums being women, Home was a Scottish man who became perhaps the most famous medium in all of Europe. What made Home particularly remarkable was that he never charged money for his séances, which lent him an air of authenticity that commercial mediums often lacked. Born in 1833 near Edinburgh, Home claimed his powers emerged in childhood, and by his 20s, he was performing séances for some of the most powerful people in Europe. His signature feat was levitation. Dozens of witnesses, including respected scientists and nobility, testified that they had seen Home float into the air during séances, sometimes rising right up to the ceiling. On one famous occasion in December of 1868, at a séance in London, multiple witnesses claimed to have seen Home float out of a third-story window and float back in through another window in an adjacent room, 80 feet above the street below. Whether you believe these accounts or not, the fact that such respectable witnesses were willing to stake their reputations on what they'd seen tells us something profound about how seriously spiritualism was being taken. The phenomenon of spirit photography emerged in the early 1860s, adding another dimension to spiritualist practice. It began in Boston in 1861 when a photographer named William Mumler was developing a self-portrait and noticed what appeared to be a ghostly figure standing beside his own image. He claimed it was the spirit of his deceased cousin. Mumler began offering spirit photography sessions, and soon the practice spread to Britain. For grieving Victorians, the possibility of obtaining a photograph with their departed loved ones was overwhelming. People would sit for these special photographs, and when the plates were developed, mysterious figures would appear beside them, often draped in flowing white garments, sometimes recognizable as the deceased, sometimes appearing as luminous orbs or misty forms. The photographs looked hauntingly real, and for those who wanted to believe, they provided tangible proof that their loved ones persisted beyond death. Of course, spirit photography was also remarkably easy to fake using double exposure techniques, but that didn't stop thousands of people from seeking out spirit photographers, cherishing the resulting images as precious connections to those they'd lost. The overlap between spiritualism and the new technology of photography created a powerful synergy. Both seemed to reveal hidden truths invisible to the naked eye. Both produced permanent records of fleeting moments, and both required specialized knowledge and equipment, lending them an aura of scientific credibility. Now, as spiritualism grew in popularity, it inevitably attracted the attention of the established church, and the reaction was complicated. Some clergy members were deeply hostile, viewing spiritualism as heresy and devil worship, a dangerous deviation from Christian doctrine. They preached against it from their pulpits, warning their congregations that attempting to contact the dead was forbidden in Scripture and that any spirits manifesting at séances were likely demons in disguise. But interestingly, not all religious leaders took this stance. Some clergymen became deeply involved in spiritualism, arguing that communication with the dead was entirely compatible with Christian beliefs about the immortality of the soul. They pointed to biblical accounts of prophets and visions, suggesting that spiritualism was simply a modern continuation of ancient spiritual practices. This created fascinating debates within Victorian religious circles, with spiritualist clergy members writing theological treatises attempting to reconcile séance room practices with Christian doctrine. The Church's divided response actually helped spiritualism gain credibility, as it showed this wasn't simply a fringe superstition but a phenomenon worthy of serious theological consideration. In 1869, a particularly important development occurred with the formation of the London Dialectical Society's Committee to investigate spiritualist phenomena. This wasn't a ghost club in the informal sense, but rather a subcommittee of a serious intellectual debating society, comprised of 33 members including Fellows of the Royal Society, medical doctors, journalists, and clergymen. They spent 2 years conducting systematic investigations, holding 40 séances, interviewing dozens of witnesses, and compiling their findings into a substantial report published in 1871. What made their conclusions so significant was that the majority of the committee, despite having begun as skeptics, concluded that the phenomena they witnessed were genuine and inexplicable by known physical laws. They had witnessed tables moving without physical contact, heard unexplained sounds, and observed other phenomena under conditions they believed eliminated the possibility of fraud. Their report caused a sensation, lending spiritualism a degree of scientific legitimacy it had never before possessed. The 1870s also saw the emergence of what were called physical mediums, who specialized in producing dramatic physical phenomena rather than simply relaying verbal messages from spirits. These séances were spectacular affairs. Objects would fly through the rooms, tambourines would shake and jingle while floating through the air, spirit hands would materialize and touch participants, and sometimes entire spirit forms would walk around the séance room, solid enough to be touched. One of the most famous physical mediums was Florence Cook, a young English woman who, beginning in 1871 at just 15 years old, began producing full-form materializations of a spirit she called Katie King. During Florence's séances, conducted in near-total darkness, Katie King would emerge from the cabinet where Florence sat in trance, walking among the sitters, allowing them to touch her, speaking to them in a voice distinct from Florence's own. Katie King became something of a celebrity in spiritualist circles, and the séances were investigated by none other than Sir William Crookes, one of Britain's most distinguished scientists and a Fellow of the Royal Society. William Crookes's investigation of Florence Cook and Katie King between 1871 and 1874 represents one of the most controversial episodes in the history of spiritualism. Crookes was a chemist and physicist of the highest standing, the discoverer of the element thallium, inventor of the radiometer, and a man whose scientific credentials were impeccable. When he announced he was going to investigate spiritualist claims, the scientific community expected him to expose the frauds once and for all. Instead, after extensive testing under controlled conditions, including photographing Katie King and conducting experiments to verify that Florence and Katie were indeed two separate entities, Crookes declared he was convinced the phenomena were genuine. He published papers describing how he had seen Katie King and Florence Cook simultaneously, how he had measured Katie's height and found it different from Florence's, how Katie's pulse rate was different. His endorsement of Florence Cook was sensational, and it divided the scientific community sharply. Some colleagues respected his thoroughness and were shaken by his conclusions. Others believed he had been duped, or worse, that an inappropriate relationship with the young medium had clouded his judgment. To this day, historians debate what really happened in those séances. But regardless of the truth behind any individual medium's claims, what we can say with certainty is that by the mid-1870s, spiritualism had become thoroughly embedded in Victorian culture. It wasn't just a parlor entertainment anymore. It was a movement with its own newspapers and journals, international networks of practitioners, formal organizations, and most importantly, the attention of serious scientists, philosophers, and academics who believed that investigating these phenomena might unlock fundamental truths about consciousness, life, death, and the nature of reality itself. The ghost clubs were growing more sophisticated, more organized, and they were about to take their most significant step yet. On the 20th of February, 1882, something momentous occurred in the drawing room of a house in London. A group of distinguished scholars, including philosophers, classical scholars, physicists, and poets gathered together and formally established the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR as it came to be known. This was the culmination of everything the earlier ghost clubs had been working toward, a proper scientific organization dedicated to investigating paranormal phenomena with rigorous methodology. The first president was Henry Sidgwick, a professor of moral philosophy at Cambridge University, a man of unimpeachable intellectual reputation. The founding members read like a who's who of Victorian intellectual life. There was Edmund Gurney, a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. Frederick W. H. Myers, a classical scholar and poet. And later, the membership would include figures like William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, and even a future Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour. These weren't cranks or charlatans. These were some of the finest minds of the age, bringing serious academic scrutiny to questions about telepathy, apparitions, mediumship, and survival after death. The Society for Psychical Research divided its investigations into several committees, each focusing on different aspects of paranormal phenomena. One committee investigated thought transference, what we would now call telepathy. They conducted thousands of experiments, asking subjects to guess cards or drawings being concentrated on by someone in another room, carefully recording their results and subjecting them to statistical analysis. Another committee collected accounts of apparitions and hauntings, eventually compiling over 700 detailed case studies. They would interview witnesses, visit haunted locations, attempt to correlate sightings with deaths or other significant events, and try to determine patterns in how and why ghosts appeared. The rigor they brought to this work was unprecedented. They weren't just collecting ghost stories. They were attempting to build a science of the supernatural. One of the SPR's most significant early projects was their investigation of something they called crisis apparitions. These were cases where someone saw an apparition of a friend or family member at the exact moment that person died, often hundreds of miles away, with no normal means of communication. Edmund Gurney, Frederick Myers, and Frank Podmore spent years collecting and verifying these accounts, eventually publishing their findings in 1886 in a massive 2-volume work called Phantasms of the Living. The book contained over 700 cases, meticulously investigated and documented. They tracked down witnesses, verified death times, ruled out cases where prior knowledge of illness might have influenced the experience, and applied statistical analysis to determine whether these experiences occurred more frequently than chance would allow. Their conclusion was striking. They found that apparitions were seen at the time of someone's death far more often than random probability could explain, suggesting some kind of genuine telepathic connection between the dying and the living. Whether you find their arguments convincing or not, the thoroughness of their methodology was remarkable and represented a new level of scholarly attention being paid to supernatural claims. Now, while the SPR was conducting its careful investigations in Britain, American spiritualism was developing its own unique characteristics. In the United States, spiritualism had become closely intertwined with progressive social movements. Spiritualist communities became hotbeds of radical thinking about social reform. Many prominent suffragettes were spiritualists, and there was a strong connection between the movement for women's rights and spiritualist practice. This made sense in a way. If women could be powerful mediums, conduits for wisdom from the spirit world, authorities in the séance room, then why shouldn't they have the vote? Why shouldn't they have equal rights? Spiritualist newspapers published articles advocating for women's suffrage, the abolition of slavery, temperance, and other reform causes. The spirits, it seemed, were quite progressive in their politics. This gave spiritualism in America a more overtly political character than it often had in Britain, though British spiritualism also attracted freethinkers and those questioning traditional social hierarchies. Back in Britain, the 1880s saw the emergence of what might be called professional ghost hunters, investigators who made it their life's work to attend séances, test mediums, and expose fraud. One of the most dedicated was Richard Hodgson, an Australian-born member of the SPR who became famous for his skeptical investigations. Hodgson had trained in law and philosophy, and he brought a prosecutor's mindset to séances. He learned stage magic techniques so he could spot trickery. He would secretly mark objects to see if they'd been switched. He became expert at detecting the use of accomplices and hidden apparatus. Between 1882 and 1884, Hodgson conducted an extensive investigation of the famous medium Madame Helena Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society. His report, published by the SPR, was devastating, concluding that phenomena attributed to spirits were achieved through trapdoors, sliding panels, and confederates. He called her one of the most accomplished and ingenious impostors in history. Hodgson's work showed that the SPR was willing to reach negative conclusions, which actually enhanced their credibility when they did find phenomena they couldn't explain. The late Victorian period also saw the rise of what were called home circles, regular spiritualist gatherings held in private homes with the same small group of participants meeting week after week. These weren't formal séances with professional mediums, but rather groups of friends and family members who would sit together in the dark, hands linked, and wait for manifestations. Home circles became enormously popular because they democratized spiritualism. You didn't need to pay a medium or join an organization. You could explore the spirit world from your own parlor with people you trusted. Instructions for conducting home circles were published in spiritualist magazines, advising on everything from the ideal number of participants, usually 6 to 8, to what time of day was best for spirit communication, generally between 8 and 10 in the evening, to how to arrange the furniture and what questions to ask. Some home circles reported extraordinary phenomena, developing their own regular spirit communicators who would visit week after week, becoming almost like invisible members of the family. Interestingly, home circles often developed what spiritualists called a cabinet medium within the group, someone who consistently produced the strongest phenomena. This person would typically sit in a curtained-off corner or closet, the cabinet, while in trance, and spirits would materialize nearby or objects would be thrown from the cabinet. The cabinet was believed to concentrate the psychic energy, creating ideal conditions for spirits to manifest. Skeptics, of course, noted that the cabinet also conveniently prevented observers from seeing exactly what the medium was doing, and that many tricks became much easier when performed from behind a curtain. But for believers, the cabinet was an essential piece of spiritualist technology, as important as the darkened room or the linked hands. As the 1880s progressed, we also begin to see the emergence of scientific instruments being brought into the séance room. Investigators started using spring balances to measure whether objects really levitated or were being lifted by normal force. They used recording thermometers to check claims that temperatures dropped when spirits materialized. They brought cameras with flash powder to try to photograph phenomena. Some experimenters even constructed special séance rooms with electrical circuits that would be broken if anyone moved from their seat, attempting to prove that phenomena occurred without anyone leaving their chair. This was the Victorian scientific mindset at work, the belief that any phenomenon, even a supernatural one, could be measured, quantified, and tested. The ghost clubs and the SPR were determined to bring the spirit world into the laboratory, to make the invisible visible, to subject the metaphysical to physical measurement. It was an extraordinary collision between ancient beliefs about spirits and ghosts and the most modern scientific thinking of the industrial age. By the end of the 1880s, spiritualism had been a major cultural force in Britain and America for 4 decades. It had spawned organizations, journals, churches, and communities. It had attracted both the desperate and the distinguished, the gullible and the brilliant. It had been investigated, tested, exposed, defended, and debated. And yet it persisted, continued to grow, continued to draw people to darkened rooms where tables rapped and spirits whispered, because at its heart, spiritualism offered something that science and religion sometimes struggled to provide, a sense of comfort, a promise that death was not the end, that love transcended the grave, and that those we'd lost were not truly gone but simply waiting for us in another room, separated only by the thinnest of veils. As we move into the 1890s, let's explore one of the most intriguing aspects of Victorian spiritualism, the phenomenon of automatic writing. This practice involved mediums entering a trance state and allowing spirits to guide their hands, writing messages without conscious control. The medium would hold a pen or pencil, and their hand would begin to move across the page, sometimes writing at tremendous speed, producing pages and pages of text in handwriting that looked nothing like the medium's normal script. Sometimes the writing would be backwards or in mirror script. Sometimes it would be in languages the medium didn't consciously know. The most famous practitioner of automatic writing was an American medium named Pearl Curran, though her story truly develops after the Victorian era. But in Britain during the 1890s, automatic writing séances became increasingly popular because they produced tangible evidence, actual written documents that could be studied, analyzed, and preserved. Families treasured these automatic writings as letters from beyond, reading and rereading messages from their departed loved ones. The SPR took particular interest in automatic writing, seeing it as potentially easier to study than other phenomena because it left a permanent record. They collected samples, analyzed handwriting, studied the content of messages, and attempted to verify information provided by spirits. In some cases, they found automatic scripts containing accurate information that the medium seemingly couldn't have known through normal means: names, dates, personal details about deceased individuals that the medium had never met. These cases were puzzling and fascinating. Were they evidence of genuine spirit communication? Or was something else happening, perhaps the medium accessing information through some form of telepathy with the living, or drawing on forgotten memories buried in their subconscious? These questions led SPR researchers deeper into the mysteries of the human mind itself. Now, the 1890s also brought us one of the most sophisticated frauds in spiritualist history, and the story is worth telling because it reveals just how elaborate deceptions could become. An Italian medium named Eusapia Palladino rose to international fame in this decade, and she's a fascinating figure because she may have been both genuine and fraudulent. Palladino was investigated dozens of times by prominent researchers across Europe. She was a physical medium who produced spectacular phenomena, levitating tables, causing objects to move at a distance, producing phantom hands that could be felt and touched, and even partial materializations. What made her so puzzling was that she was caught cheating on multiple occasions, using her foot to lift tables when investigators weren't watching carefully, freeing a hand to manipulate objects in the dark. Yet even when investigators took elaborate precautions, tying her, controlling her limbs, using luminous paint to track movements, phenomena still occurred that seemed inexplicable. Some researchers concluded she was purely fraudulent and simply very clever. Others believed she had genuine psychic abilities but would resort to trickery when her powers weren't working, unwilling to disappoint her audience. The debates about Palladino in the pages of SPR journals became quite heated, with respected investigators who had examined her under similar conditions reaching completely opposite conclusions. This brings us to an important point about Victorian ghost clubs and the SPR. These organizations weren't united in their beliefs. They contained a spectrum of opinion, from true believers convinced that survival after death was scientifically proven, to complete skeptics who believed all spiritualist phenomena could be explained by fraud, delusion, or misperception, to those in the middle who thought there might be something genuine happening but weren't sure what it was. This internal diversity was actually one of the organization's great strengths. Meetings and publications featured genuine debates, with members challenging each other's methods and conclusions. It meant that findings had to withstand scrutiny from multiple perspectives before being accepted, and it prevented the organization from becoming merely a cheerleading society for spiritualism. During this same period, the 1890s, we see the development of what spiritualists called direct voice mediumship. Earlier mediums had typically spoken in trance, their own voices changing pitch and character as different spirits supposedly took control. But direct voice mediums claimed that spirits could speak independently, without using the medium's vocal cords at all. Spirit voices would seem to come from different parts of the room, sometimes multiple spirits speaking simultaneously. To facilitate this, mediums began using trumpets, cone-shaped devices usually made of aluminum or cardboard, which would float around the darkened séance room while spirit voices emanated from them. Believers described hearing departed relatives speak with their characteristic accents and speech patterns, discussing private family matters that the medium couldn't possibly have known. The voices were sometimes recorded on early phonograph equipment, creating another form of tangible evidence. Skeptics, however, noted that these séances required complete darkness and that ventriloquism, the art of throwing one's voice, was a well-known theatrical technique. The trumpets, they suggested, were merely props to direct attention away from the medium's own cleverly disguised voice. The late Victorian period also witnessed the phenomenon of spirit paintings and drawings. Certain mediums claimed they could produce artwork while in trance, guided by deceased artists. The medium would work rapidly, sometimes in darkness or blindfolded, and produce portraits allegedly of spirits or guided by spirits like famous dead painters. Some of these artworks were quite accomplished, which raised interesting questions. How could someone with little artistic training produce competent portraits? Spiritualists saw it as proof of spirit guidance. Skeptics noted that many of these mediums had more artistic experience than they initially admitted, and that the artworks, while perhaps impressive for their speed of production, weren't really of the quality one would expect from master artists. Still, spirit art became another branch of mediumistic practice, and some mediums became quite well known for their artistic productions, holding exhibitions and selling their spirit-guided works to collectors. Another development in the 1890s was the increasing use of séance photographs as evidence. Now, we've already discussed spirit photography, but this was different. These were photographs taken during actual séances, attempting to capture phenomena as they occurred. With magnesium flash powder becoming more readily available, investigators could suddenly illuminate a darkened séance room and capture whatever was happening in that instant. Some photographs appeared to show ectoplasm streaming from mediums' bodies, spirit forms materializing, or levitating objects frozen in midair. These photographs became subjects of intense scrutiny. Were they genuine records of paranormal events? Or had they been manipulated through double exposure, creative darkroom work, or simple staging? Photography experts and SPR investigators would examine prints with magnifying glasses, looking for evidence of tampering, analyzing shadows and perspectives. The debate over séance photography mirrored larger Victorian anxieties about photographs themselves. Could cameras truly reveal objective reality? Or could they be manipulated to deceive? The photograph, like the séance itself, existed in this uncertain space between truth and illusion, documentation and performance. As the 19th century drew to a close, spiritualism found itself at an interesting crossroads. On one hand, it had achieved remarkable cultural penetration. There were spiritualist churches holding regular services, complete with hymns, prayers, and demonstrations of mediumship. There were spiritualist summer camps where believers could gather for weeks of lectures, séances, and fellowship. Spiritualist books were bestsellers. The movement had its own infrastructure, its own social world. Yet at the same time, exposés of fraudulent mediums were becoming more common and more publicized. Investigators were getting better at detecting tricks. The popular press ran sensational stories about court frauds, damaged mediums dragging fake ectoplasm made from cheesecloth and photographs showing spirit hands that were clearly rubber gloves. The tension between belief and skepticism, between the desire for comfort and the demand for truth, was becoming sharper. Through all of this, the ghost clubs and the SPR continued their work, investigating, documenting, debating. They had accumulated vast archives of testimonies, photographs, recordings, and experimental data. They had developed sophisticated protocols for testing mediums. They had created a vocabulary and a methodology for discussing paranormal phenomena in scientific terms. Whether or not they had proven the existence of life after death, and opinions on that varied considerably even within their ranks, they had certainly demonstrated that these questions could be approached seriously, systematically, and skeptically. They had brought the ghost story out of folklore and into the realm of organized inquiry, and in doing so, they had created something genuinely new, a space where science and the supernatural could meet, where educated people could discuss spirits and séances without abandoning their commitment to reason and evidence. As the new century approached, these investigators prepared to carry their work forward into the modern age, armed with new technologies, refined methods, and an unshakable curiosity about the mysteries that lay beyond the veil. As we enter the early 1900s, one of the most significant developments in psychical research was the emergence of cross-correspondences. This was an extraordinarily complex phenomenon that emerged after the deaths of several key SPR researchers, including Henry Sidgwick in 1900 and Edmund Gurney in 1888, and Frederick Myers in 1901. Multiple mediums in different countries, working independently and often not knowing each other, began receiving automatic writing messages that seemed to be fragments of a larger communication. Each message was incomplete on its own, but when researchers compared messages received on the same day by mediums in England, India, and America, they found that the fragments fit together like pieces of a puzzle, forming coherent literary allusions and references. The messages claimed to be from the deceased SPR researchers, particularly Myers, who was supposedly orchestrating this elaborate scheme from the afterlife to provide evidence that couldn't be explained by telepathy between the living mediums. The cross-correspondences continued for decades, filling thousands of pages with intricate classical allusions, and they remain one of the most debated cases in psychical research history. Critics argued they could be explained by coincidence or by the mediums subconsciously coordinating, but the complexity and duration of the phenomenon impressed many investigators. The Edwardian era also brought us the remarkable case of the Crewe Circle spirit photographers, a group operating from 1903 onward in the small town of Crewe in Cheshire. Led by a man named William Hope, they specialized in producing photographs where spirits of the dead appeared clearly alongside the living sitters. What made the Crewe Circle particularly successful was that Hope would often use the sitter's own camera and photographic plates, which seemed to rule out simple fraud. Bereaved families traveled from across Britain to Crewe, hoping to receive a photograph with their departed loved ones. The results were often striking, with recognizable faces appearing, draped in characteristic white gauze, floating beside or behind the living subjects. The Crewe Circle operated for years with a strong reputation, and their photographs brought comfort to thousands of grieving families. However, in 1922, Harry Price, a prominent psychical investigator and magician, examined Hope using secretly marked photographic plates and caught him substituting plates to create the spirit images. The exposure was devastating, but it came after nearly 2 decades of successful practice, and many believers refused to accept that all of Hope's photographs had been fraudulent, arguing that perhaps he had genuine abilities but occasionally resorted to trickery. Now, the early 20th century also saw spiritualism intersect with the emerging field of psychology, particularly with the work of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Both men attended séances and were interested in spiritualist phenomena, though they approached it from psychological rather than supernatural perspectives. Freud was generally dismissive, seeing spiritualism as wishful thinking driven by unconscious desires. But Jung was more intrigued. His doctoral dissertation, completed in 1902, was actually based on his observations of a young medium relative who conducted séances. Jung attended multiple séances with her and documented the different personalities that emerged during her trances. Rather than dismissing these as fraud or spirit possession, Jung began developing his theories about the unconscious mind, suggesting that these alternate personalities might be autonomous fragments of the psyche. This psychological approach to mediumship offered a third way between supernatural acceptance and outright skepticism, suggesting that real phenomena might be occurring, but originating from the depths of the human mind rather than from discarnate spirits. The years leading up to the First World War saw enormous advances in technology, and ghost hunters eagerly adopted new tools. The phonograph allowed investigators to record spirit voices for later analysis. Motion picture cameras were used to film séances, creating moving images of alleged phenomena. Sensitive thermometers could detect minute temperature changes. Electronic equipment could measure electromagnetic fluctuations. Some investigators even experimented with X-ray photography, wondering if spirits might be visible in wavelengths invisible to the human eye. There was an optimism among psychical researchers that modern technology would finally settle the question definitively. If spirit materialization was real, surely a motion picture camera would capture it unambiguously? If spirit voices were real, wouldn't a phonograph record them with perfect fidelity? This technological approach represented both the promise and the limitation of the Ghost Club's methodology. They were applying scientific instruments to phenomena that, if genuine, might not operate according to physical laws amenable to measurement. Then came the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, and it transformed spiritualism profoundly. The war killed approximately 17 million people, including hundreds of thousands of young British men who died in the trenches of France and Belgium. Suddenly, almost every family in Britain was touched by bereavement. The grief was staggering, overwhelming, and spiritualism experienced a massive resurgence as desperate families sought contact with their fallen sons, husbands, and fathers. Mediums were inundated with requests. Séances were held constantly. The demand far exceeded the supply of established mediums, and unfortunately, this led to an influx of fraudulent practitioners taking advantage of vulnerable, grieving people. The tragedy of the war gave spiritualism renewed purpose and popularity, but it also intensified the ethical questions about mediumship. Was it compassionate to offer hope of communication with the dead? Or was it cruel to exploit grief for profit? Among those drawn to spiritualism by wartime loss was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Doyle had been interested in spiritualism since the 1880s, but his son's death in 1918 from pneumonia, following war injuries, intensified his commitment to the cause. Doyle became spiritualism's most prominent advocate, writing books, giving lectures worldwide, and using his fame to promote the movement. What's particularly interesting is the contrast between Doyle's literary creation, Sherlock Holmes, who was all rational deduction and skeptical inquiry, and Doyle himself, who became increasingly credulous about spiritualist claims. He believed in the Cottingley fairies, a famous case where two young girls claimed to have photographed fairies in their garden, photographs that were later revealed to be paper cutouts. Doyle's advocacy brought spiritualism enormous publicity, but his willingness to believe in doubtful evidence also made the movement vulnerable to ridicule. His friendship and later feud with the magician Harry Houdini perfectly encapsulated the tensions within spiritualism. Houdini, despite desperately wanting to contact his dead mother, dedicated himself to exposing fraudulent mediums, while Doyle believed many of them were genuine. The 1920s also brought us the development of trance mediumship as a more refined practice, with mediums who could channel specific spirit guides who would speak through them over many years. One of the most famous was Gladys Osborne Leonard, who worked with an SPR investigator named Charles Drayton Thomas for decades. Leonard had a spirit guide named Feeder who would speak through her in a high-pitched, childlike voice, relaying messages from the deceased. What made Leonard particularly interesting to researchers was her consistency. Feeder's personality remained stable across thousands of sittings, and the information provided was sometimes remarkably accurate and specific. Thomas conducted careful experiments, having deceased individuals, through feeder, described the contents of books on specific shelves in houses they had lived in, information Leonard couldn't have accessed normally. The book tests, as they were called, produced some striking hits, where the spirit correctly identified books and even passage numbers that contained relevant words or themes. Leonard was investigated extensively and never caught in fraud, making her one of the most credible mediums of her era, though skeptics naturally proposed alternative explanations involving subtle cues and lucky guesses. As the 1920s progressed, we also see the establishment of more formal haunting investigation protocols. Ghost clubs would visit allegedly haunted locations with notebooks, cameras, thermometers, and measuring tape, conducting what we might call the first paranormal investigations in the modern sense. They would map haunted buildings, noting where phenomena were reported, at what times, under what conditions. They would conduct vigils, sitting in cold, dark rooms for hours, waiting for ghostly manifestations. They interviewed witnesses, compared accounts, looked for patterns. Some clubs began to specialize in particular types of hauntings, whether poltergeist cases with physical disturbances, or apparitional cases with visual manifestations, or place memory hauntings where the same scene seemed to replay like a recording. This systematic approach to haunting investigation laid the groundwork for all modern ghost hunting, establishing methods and categories that are still used today. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, spiritualism was beginning to decline from its peak, though it certainly didn't disappear. The war's immediate aftermath had passed, the initial wave of grief had subsided somewhat, and a new generation was coming of age that was perhaps more skeptical, more modern in outlook. The exposures of fraudulent mediums had taken their toll on the movement's credibility. Psychology was offering alternative explanations for mediumistic phenomena that didn't require spirits. And yet, the infrastructure that Victorian and Edwardian spiritualism had built remained. The SPR continued its work, still publishing its journal, still investigating claims. Spiritualist churches remained active, their congregations smaller perhaps but committed. The Ghost Club, one of the oldest of the paranormal investigation societies, reconstituted in 1938 and continues to this day. The legacy of Victorian spiritualism and the ghost clubs that investigated it echoes through all modern interest in the paranormal, from ghost hunting television shows to academic parapsychology programs, from mediums working today to skeptical investigation organizations. The questions the Victorians asked: can consciousness survive death? Are there realms beyond the physical? How do we distinguish genuine phenomena from fraud? Remain just as relevant and just as unanswered as they were in those candlelit séance rooms of the 19th century. And so, as we reach the end of our journey together through this remarkable period of history, we can reflect on what the Victorians achieved in their investigation of the supernatural. They took questions that had been the domain of superstition and folklore and subjected them to systematic inquiry. They created organizations, methods, and vocabularies that persist today. They wrestled with profound questions about consciousness, death, evidence, and belief. They were, in their way, pioneers exploring the borderlands of human experience, that mysterious territory where the physical and the metaphysical might touch. Whether you believe they found genuine evidence of life after death or simply documented the depths of human hope, grief, and capacity for self-deception, their story remains fascinating, a window into how the modern scientific worldview encountered and grappled with ancient human longings for connection with those we've lost. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the candlelit rooms and darkened parlors of Victorian spiritualism. I hope you found some interest, perhaps some comfort, and maybe even a little sense of wonder in these strange and beautiful stories from the past. Rest well.